Not so long ago, a friend of mine, let's call her Janet, tried to convince me that her brother, let's call him Brad, had psychic powers. She said that within seconds of Brad predicting that the father of one of his friends had had a stroke, he'd got a phone call out of the blue from the friend, confirming this was true. It was an impressive sounding story, but what Janet failed to remember was that I actually witnessed the whole event myself, and Brad hadn't predicted a stroke, he'd predicted death. Also, the phone call wasn't out of the blue. The friend had left an answer phone message earlier on saying she would call at 10 a.m, and Brad said that in this message his friend had sounded terribly upset. You might say Brad's guess was still close, but how close was it really? His prediction was death. If a stroke can be counted as a hit, then how many hundreds of other threats to our health could also be considered hits? And given that Brad knew his friend had no family except her elderly father, her tearful message would have been a big clue as to what was wrong. What upsets us more than the endangered health of our loved ones? It interested me that Janet had distorted and omitted important information with her anecdote in her attempt to convince me that Brad was psychic. I put all these details to her, but she didn't accept any of it until we both spoke to her brother, who confirmed everything I said. At that stage she laughed it off as a silly quirk of her memory. But if her brother hadn't corrected her, there's every reason to think she would have convinced herself, and probably would have gone on to try and convince others, that it all happened the way she reported it to me. Although anecdotes can be useful in certain contexts, they can't be used to establish the truth of paranormal or scientific claims without more rigorous supporting evidence. Humans can be too biased and are far too prone to making all kinds of errors for us to regard either spoken or written personal testimony as reliable, and when it comes to paranormal claims, anecdotes are often all we have. A couple of months after my last surviving grandparent died, I witnessed the birth of a potential paranormal anecdote. During a large family occasion, with most of us gathered together in one room, there was a coughing sound outside. One of my relatives froze, looking shocked, then said, "There you are, that's him, that's his ghost." Seconds later, another relative came into the room, coughing. What interested me here was the speed with which an unremarkable sound was taken as evidence that my grandfather was manifesting in ghostly form. There was no thought of the cough being anything other than a ghost. The paranormal interpretation was made instantly. My grandfather was visiting us from some kind of afterlife. Clearly this was a case of wishful thinking, quite understandable given my grandfather's recent death, and fortunately in this case we quickly established where the cough had come from. But if we hadn't, this incident might have been put forward as anecdotal evidence of ghosts. Human perception is too prone to interpretation for us to rely on anecdotes. Take this cube. It could be rotating clockwise or anti-clockwise. Once you see the cube moving in one direction, you might find it quite hard to make it flip into the other. But both interpretations work throughout the animation. You can see this if you concentrate. And yet I've heard people insist there's only one direction in which the cube could be moving. Perception, like memory, is an active process, prone to distortion in all sorts of ways. Our brains have to select, extract, and then reintegrate the information coming to us through our senses. And when the information has multiple interpretations or is incomplete or obscured, for instance if we're trying to see something in the dark or hear someone talking above loud music, we're apt to make mistakes. Sometimes we experience illusions without realizing it. Sometimes even the knowledge that we're being presented with an illusion isn't enough to stop us experiencing it. This is a static picture, and yet it appears to be moving, especially when you shift your attention left to right or up and down. In this picture, the straight lines appear oblique. In this picture, dots appear where no dots have been drawn. In this picture, the static circles appear to rotate if you move your head closer to the screen than further away. Our hearing is also susceptible to illusions. One fascinating auditory illusion is the so-called quintina, a ghostly high-registered fifth voice that emerges when four lower male voices harmonise in a particular style of Sardinian a cappella singing. This illusory voice is thought by some to be the voice of the Virgin Mary, when it's actually only an effect of the particular notes and harmonics achieved by the male singers. Our perceptions aren't always trustworthy, which is another reason why it's important to have corroborating evidence that can be independently assessed. Of course, many people aren't always trustworthy either. Some set out deliberately to deceive others, motivated by financial or other personal gain. Fraudulent psychic mediums often use the anecdotes of their clients to reel in more gullible victims. Corrupt companies often print bogus testimonials saying how their miracle products cure all kinds of health complaint. And people who don't feel secure about their own worth often conjure up elaborate and far-fetched stories to try and win the attention they crave from others. Many people present anecdotes that serve only to confirm their own beliefs. Believers in certain stereotypes find it much easier to bring to mind examples that confirm rather than challenge those stereotypes. Skeptics on so-called ghost hunting shows are often shouted down simply for questioning supposed ghostly activity caught on camera. How much less reliable than camera footage will personal testimony be from someone who won't even consider the possibility of naturalistic explanations because their emotional attachment to their beliefs will only allow arguments that confirm them? Some might ask, aren't skeptics of paranormal explanations just as guilty of confirmation bias? Skeptics don't state as fact that paranormal phenomena don't exist. If they do exist, skeptics would want to know. But since no paranormal claim has ever been validated by independent means, paranormal explanations, unlike naturalistic ones, have to this day no credible foundation. Now that may change, but only when sufficiently rigorous evidence is produced, and that doesn't mean personal testimony. Rather than leaping to a paranormal or naturalistic explanation when you witness something that seems inexplicable to you, the least problematic response is to describe what you experienced in as much honest detail as you can, and acknowledge that, at least for the time being, you have no explanation. Anecdotes have a certain persuasive power, because many people find a personal story easier to relate to themselves than comparatively remote-seeming scientific facts and principles. But when we're listening, for example, to someone's account of what they believe to be a paranormal experience, we have no access to the event being described. At best, all we have is the person's memory of a perception of an event, with no way of ascertaining the accuracy of either the memory or the perception. Even when someone presents an anecdote that contains factual information, we can't draw reliable conclusions, because as single observations, anecdotes have no statistical value. We can't extrapolate from one case, or even a small number of cases, and make generalizations about all cases. A person who boasts that they've never developed skin cancer despite 50 years of sun worshipping, and therefore declares that sun worshipping can do you no harm, makes the mistake of presenting his particular experience as typical of all experiences. Whilst it's useful to acknowledge exceptions to trends, exceptions don't refute trends. Identifying trends involves careful consideration of all available data, not just data provided by biased or interested parties. Anecdotes can be useful and have a legitimate role in certain circumstances. They're powerful vehicles for the communication of human experience, and as the preamble to an argument, an anecdote can help establish the personal relevance of the argument, though the argument will of course require more substance if it concerns a factual claim. When they're documented in careful detail, anecdotes can provide useful information for medical case notes, and in general science they can be useful in pointing the way towards possible areas of future research. But without more rigorous supporting evidence, there are many reasons why they can't be accepted at face value as establishing the truth or falsity of paranormal or scientific claims. An anecdote can be a good starting point, but it can never be the whole story.